If you've seen the other parts, you get bragging rights in the comments. But if you haven't, go watch them right now. After 3 seasons of instability and inconsistency, Death Battle would spend this next season ironing out the kinks to pour out higher quality episodes. Many people would praise this season for being a noticeable improvement over Season 3, but how much improvement was there? Let's find out. No, seriously, I really do need to find out because I have never been aware of the general consensus of Season 4. Some people say it's good, but I've never been able to find out how good they say it is. No one says whether this season is underrated, overrated, or even overlooked. And with a few exceptions, none of its episodes get talked about in a good or bad way. I feel like there's a reason for that, but it should be noted that this was the year where Death Battle moved its production over to Rooster Teeth. Screwattack was technically still around for the next 2 years, but production would take place in Austin, Texas. And this included a major shift as to what kind of matchups they would include on the show, with a lot less emphasis on video games and more emphasis on comic books and animated series. Most notably anime, which for the most part still holds up given the most viewed episodes. With this new shift in audience, Season 4 would have the least amount of video game combatants when compared to prior seasons, and video game characters would become featured less as the series continued. This helped Death Battle reach out to wider audiences due to the large variety of characters they'd feature on the show. The series also got some nifty new visuals, most notably a new logo and transition that they still use today, which would naturally change the thumbnails as well. Originally using a standard versus thumbnail that, while recognizable, is still pretty generic given that Death Battle was starting to make DBX alongside this show, especially considering other versus shows outside of Screwattack's 2 series that started to make a name for themselves. So Death Battle's thumbnails would include this new logo and even change the renders used for the characters of previous episodes. With major changes in the brand comes major changes to the production. Once 2 episodes got their kinks ironed out, the rest of the series would have a much smoother production from this point onward. It's just that one of those kinks had to be addressed right away. If you remember last season, I mentioned that this was originally planned to be the Season 3 finale, but it had to be delayed due to Torian needing more time with his workload, as well as Power Rangers vs. Voltron getting a second delay. And despite my qualms with the episode, Hulk vs. Doomsday was able to benefit quite a bit from its delay, but unfortunately, I just cannot say the same for Lara Croft vs. Nathan Drake. I mean, right off the bat, this has one of the lowest ratings of any episode, and I don't remember it being this bad, but maybe they're onto something. I like how they show Indiana Jones in the prelude as a nod to how both characters were inspired by Indiana Jones. In fact, I think they still have interest in having Indiana Jones come on the show. Who knows? Maybe we'll see something like that. But going into these character rundowns, Lara's had a pretty good beginning, but a lot of it felt like a respect thread. I do like how most of the feats they brought up were based around her exploration and survival rather than her raw strength. It is a nice change of pace. I mean, they still talk about those as well, but they're meant to elaborate on how she was able to achieve those feats.
I think I found my next ex-wife.
What do you mean by that? Nathan's analysis kinda had this too. In some ways, it's better, and others, it's worse. With Lara, they talk about her training, then some survival feats, then her strength feats, and then go over more survival feats. But with Nathan, they cover his exploration feats and then his strength feats, literally saying that he wouldn't have accomplished those feats if he wasn't strong enough. It's a neat change of pace, but it does kinda break the flow a little bit. Though hearing the Uncharted theme really did help this analysis have more oomph to it, but otherwise, it's just another respect thread. And since his variety of feats isn't as apparent as with Lara's, the feeling of a respect thread is even stronger with Nathan's rundown. But now let's go into the fight. Ben has addressed the most common criticisms in his Road to 100 blog for this episode, and I agree with pretty much everything he says. Well, aside from one thing he points out, but we'll get there soon. For now, I want to go over the janky shots that people like to bring up. I feel like some of them would be fairly easy to fix, aside from the rendering issues of course, which would take up to 6 hours just to render 1 second of animation. Hell, it got so bad that some shots have Nathan missing his facial hair. But as for the stuff I think can be fixed, the scene where Lara shoots the Grail off of its pedestal would work if she yelled something like, "Then it's coming with me!" instead of, "Do you know what you've done?" And as for Lara's motorcycle, I feel like it still could have been shown in the beginning somewhere, even if Nathan doesn't call attention to it. I reckon that this shot of Lara snooping on him got in the way though, so I guess that's kinda fair, but maybe a wider top-down shot could have fixed it. There's also the question of how Lara was able to get out of that hole so fast, but this could have been somewhat assuaged if Lara came in from a different end, implying that she took a shortcut or that Nathan took a longer route or something. But aside from that, there's not really a lot I can defend. Specifically this line here.
Sorry, have to do what I have to do.
Don't you just love these random quirky liners that have no reasoning behind them and completely take away from the fight when they don't have to? As for the helicopter scene, okay, I don't agree with the criticism that Nathan died because of dumb luck or something. Lara literally destroyed the helicopter. Like, it even comes from a feat they brought up in the analysis. Like... Why is this criticism even a thing? I do agree with the other problem it has, though. Nathan just escapes as if that's something any combatant has ever been allowed to do. I would have fixed it by establishing a shot that shows Lara hanging onto the helicopter, then crashing through the door and causing the two to fistfight each other, with Nathan getting panicked by the heights and starts attacking incredibly recklessly, which would also tie into their point in the conclusion about how Nathan struggling to keep his cool was a genuine factor in Lara's victory. But this would allow Lara to get the upper hand and knock Nathan off of the helicopter, who falls into the same hole that Lara fell into earlier, only this time, Nathan doesn't find a way out and ends up dying due to the fall being far bigger than anything he shrugged off before. But I'll give this death some points for creativity at least. So yeah, this fight's got a lot of criticisms, but I think it has a lot of really good stuff that often gets overshadowed. Most notably the really nice character animation, with Lara's attacks, gunplay, and movement having more finesse to it, while Nathan's is more rough and clumsy, which also ties into their conclusion that Lara's training, intelligence, and experience are better than Nathan's. Plus you get moments like Nathan running backwards with his machine gun. I've heard that this is perfectly in character, but even if it wasn't, I just think this is really funny. And while I still stand that the execution is flawed, the fact that Nathan would try to escape at all does admittedly sound like something he would do. Now on to the conclusion, and this is where we get to the one thing in the Road to 100 blog I don't fully agree with. The luck always runs out point didn't need to be there given that they treated Nathan's luck almost like a footnote in his analysis. Obviously, I don't think that this is a bad point to make. I just think that given how little focus it got in his rundown, seeing it get more focus in the conclusion is a bit weird to me. But I digress. I think I'm gonna give this episode a 48 out of 100. Sure, it's not exactly impressive, but certainly not worth the dislikes. Calm down, people. Oh look, it's Lara versus Nathan. And also Shovel Knight's name isn't capitalized for some reason. RIP. I never quite understood this matchup when it first got announced, but according to this episode's Road to 100 blog, it exists because the team really wanted to bring the characters onto Death Battle, where Sam wanted to talk about Scrooge's wacky cartoon history, and the rest of the crew were huge fans of Shovel Knight. And I mean, I guess they do have the 8-bit aesthetic and pogo sticking shenanigan. Yeah, sure. But despite how fascinated they were with the wacky cartoon history, Scrooge's analysis was so boring. They don't even talk about his character for a minute before instantly going into his feats. I guess learning about what inertia does was kinda cool, and I liked how they handled the history of where he learned to sword fight. And the boat feat is a raw feat, but it gets no presentation. This is technically the debut of Mickey Mouse characters being on Death Battle, and it's just not a fun rundown at all. I do like Scrooge's end clip though. And thankfully, Shovel Knight's analysis was pretty fun. They actually cover his story before diving into his feats, and then they list how he once fought a man whose power comes from hats. I don't understand this reference, but from what I hear, it is the most based reference they could have picked, so yay. I even liked a couple of the jokes. Yes, even prepare to get raked. I mean, come on. That's just such a dumb joke to make, I love it. Though Mobile Gear is probably my favorite line in this analysis, I will admit. I guess one could say that the jokes do kind of outweigh the content of the analysis, but to be fair, they're delivered by Boomstick after Wiz covers some facts about the world of Shovel Knight. And they're also delivered with some endearing amusement. So there's a better balance between talking about the world of Shovel Knight, dissecting his feats, and making jokes from it. It actually makes me want to play Shovel Knight. Like, seriously, why have I not played this game yet? Though I will say their way of justifying Shovel Knight's low intelligence is really bad. So he's dumb because he assumed his partner was dead? What else was he supposed to think? Was there an implication that Shield Knight was actually alive the whole time? And if so, how the hell would he have known that? Whatever, don't get worked up over this. We gotta talk about this fight. And right off the bat, I have heard some people say that Shovel Knight acts out of character. Shovel Knight doesn't just break into other people's houses unless he's paid beforehand. If anyone wants to correct me, go ahead, but this is just what I've heard. But for now, I want to talk about the first thing you notice when the fight starts, the 8-bit aesthetic. It does look nice at points, but other times the items kind of blend with the interior, with this scene of Scrooge playing golf with his own pots being the worst case of it, not helped by the ugly vomit-colored walls and treasure chests. Now, I do admire Louise's dedication to it, with a giant portrait of Scrooge being made in an NES pixel art style, the music being from classic games like Super Contra and Ninja Gaiden, the Mega Man sound effects, the Screwattack sound from Super Smash Bros. Melee, and Scrooge's panting being compressed in an 8-bit style. This is a level of effort that I will never not respect. But unfortunately, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. None of this saves the fight for a couple of reasons. The first is that Scrooge gets bodied for 90% of the entire fight. Every normal hit he gets is either no-selled by Shovel Knight or does nothing, until the death where he basically pulls it out of his butt feathers. You might notice that Beast vs. Goliath also had this problem, and everyone and their mother has criticized that episode for it, yet I almost never see it talked about with this episode. But otherwise, this is the episode that made it my least favorite genre of death battle this side of BlazBlue hate pieces. And the second is that they barely use any of their kits. Scrooge only uses his cane, which hardly does anything, the 2 Hax guns for the death, some random pots lying around in his mansion, which Shovel Knight easily takes care of, and 1 cannon, which Shovel Knight also just no-sells. And by the way, he has it even worse. He only uses his shovel blade, flare wand, dust knuckles, and his fishing rod. Okay. Even I have to admit, the way he uses the fishing rod is pretty epic. No Icors, none of Scrooge's other blasters, not even the Warhorn, which Boomstick literally says is his favorite weapon in Shovel Knight's arsenal. He also said that the one blaster that can shoot through metal doors is also his favorite weapon of Scrooge's. There's also a positioning error with Scrooge falling fairly close to his cannon. But once they enter Scrooge's golden vault, the cannon is somehow much higher up despite being way heavier. Either Scrooge should have gotten crushed by his own cannon, or the cannon should have fallen into the vault first. But I will admit, the ending is pretty rad. It's completely brutal to where you can see Shovel Knight's neck muscles for a bit when Scrooge cuts his head off with his own weapon. And the outro clip has Scrooge keeping the shovel and hanging Shovel Knight's helmet on a billboard that says "Thieves Beware." Okay, that is absolutely something Scrooge would do. But as for the conclusion, I have no idea why they say Scrooge's old age was his biggest strength, when earlier in his rundown they said it was one of his biggest weaknesses. Otherwise, I'm sorry, I really don't like this episode. Yes, it has a unique style to it, but that doesn't matter to me when the visuals keep blending in with the ugly colors of the walls. And even with that taken out of the equation, it's still a boring episode where the characters barely use any of their arsenals, and the character that they describe as aggressive either keeps running away or gets bodied until the ass-pull kill. I just can't get behind the popularity of this episode. 49 out of 100. Shovel Knight vs. Arthur when? Hey look, it's Mog Slothman! But am I the only person that really likes Venom vs. Bane as a matchup? I mean, I get why people might not be into it now, but it does at least have the whole antithesis of Spider-Man and Batman that become enemies with them due to their unadulterated obsession with them. I don't know, that's actually a really cool theme when you think about it. And hey, since Venom is one of my favorite Marvel characters, I really liked his analysis. They covered his backstory, the symbiote's origin, obsession with Spider-Man, and abilities in interesting ways, and had some okay jokes here and there. Though admittedly it is kinda hard carried by how much I really like Venom, and I reckon people who aren't big fans of Venom would probably find his analysis to be pretty boring. And disappointingly, that's how I felt with Bane's analysis. Given how seasons 2 and 3 made me appreciate and even outright love characters I never would have given a second thought otherwise, I was hoping they'd do the same thing for Bane. But while it did make his connections with Venom intriguing in a way that some previous episodes failed to do, it didn't go all the way with it like previous seasons did. Though I do like the running theme of Boomstick complaining about their name origins and the other jokes were okay. But then we get into the fight and what did I say in my edgy characters video again? Death battle turning him into swole carnage twice. Yep, that still applies here. I get the idea of what they were going for. They wanted to play into the horror elements of the symbiote. the elements that fit a character like Carnage infinitely more. But the animation is so sloppy that it creates the illusion of a bar fight between two drunkards instead of a fight between two powerhouses. Like, dude, that is missing the point of your own point that you think is the point of the character you're already missing the point of. That is 4 different points, and I'm pretty sure at least 2 of them didn't even need to exist, and yet you missed them anyway. How in the hell is that possible? No joke, only 3 attacks have any meaningful impact. There are a ton of incorrect animations, like where Bane throws Venom by the tongue with an overhead swing, lingering on the shot for a whole 4 seconds before chucking him with a limp-looking backhand. Like, how did these two connect with one another? See, this animation's so confusing, it's making me stutter! Oh, and there's this jungle. He's like, date. That's not what juggling looks like. What the hell are you doing? But, okay. The death does look really cool. It was requested by Chad because it gives him the death he originally wanted for Batman vs. Spiderman, where he chokes Batman to death by shooting webs down his throat. Ooh, wow, how did you come up with that? It's a brutal kill, it has great sound design, and his last line is still as bad and unfitting as the rest of his dialogue. So yeah, Swole Carnage vs. Bane, definitely not a great episode. 30 out of 100. Saved by ironic enjoyment and some good rundowns that are mostly carried by how much I really like Venom, but otherwise terrible in almost every conceivable way. And no, I am not watching the Rooster Teeth version. You can't make me. After 2 whole delays, we finally get to see this episode. This was the most expensive episode they've ever made. And unless if Saitama vs. Popeye broke that record, I think that still holds true today. Episode 75 is a pretty good milestone to reserve it for, though. And they went hard with the marketing, currently being the only episode to date, which not only has the 2 previews that they've been doing since the latter half of season 2, but also has 2 trailers for the cast list, as well as a blink and you'll miss it sneak peek of the custom models they worked with. Oh yeah, these models, they're all custom. Well, not all of them actually. Keith and Lance's models were apparently ripped straight from Dynasty Warriors, and Pidge's model is literally just Harry Potter. Wow, dude. How did I not see that? I don't blame them for these trailers, because the voice cast alone consists of familiar actors like Kagi, Morgan Berry, and Lanipater, but it also features Space Hamster, Andre the Black Nerd, Amalie, Kaiser Neko, Peanut Butter Gamer, and mother-loving MatPat! They all had to record remotely, but oh wait, I didn't even know they had to record remotely. That's impressive. Especially when you remember that the voice acting industry did kind of struggle with the audio balancing and audio mixing during the 2020 pandemic. Yet I didn't notice any of those issues while watching this episode. That's actually really cool. But let's not talk about the fight right now. I really want to get into these analyses. I mean, they outright say it's one of the biggest matchups in Death Battle history. Makes sense given that Ben had been wanting to do this matchup since 2012, but really think about the gravitas of all this marketing. With all the trailers, the impressive cast list, the gorgeous looking models, and then you just outright say this is one of the biggest matchups in Death Battle history, something that they still never say about any other matchup, you know you're in for a treat. Especially with both analyses having their main themes playing throughout essentially the entire time. Yes! And the Power Rangers analysis? Yep. It's actually even more fun than White Tiger Zords, where it's very similar in terms of tone and content, but this time it's conveyed with the fact that they're taking everything seriously. Talking about the abilities of the Zords outside of their abilities in the Megazord feels kind of pointless given that we don't see them doing anything outside of it, but at least it helps elaborate on why the Megazord has some mad martial arts skills. And Voltron's analysis was also pretty great. I like the Sven fake-out the joke Boomstick makes about swords being batteries. That's a cute way of pointing out connections with their opponent without being on the nose about it. Cough, 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 cough. It's a breath of fresh air that we finally get 2 rundowns that don't feel like respect threads, but something that has endless passion oozing out of the script. This is the type of analysis I've been missing since season 2, and even a couple in season 3. And now we can talk about the fight. They reused the shot of the Rangers getting damage in the cockpit multiple times. How do you think this is going down? I love how they start with the transformation scenes playing back to back with a sick lightning gradient as Brandon Yates' Stronger Together starts playing. This is the most mecha thing I've ever seen. Man, I really need to watch more mecha if this is the peak of the mecha content. I guess I'm a little surprised that Voltron doesn't use a lot of ranged combat. He only shoots spinning laser blades for 10 seconds and then a few lasers, which get reflected by the Mastodon shield. But you need the power sword now? Don't get me wrong, it's not bad. It's just that when they make a point of the Lions potentially getting motion sickness and Wiz's only response is,
That's probably why they usually travel by flight and prefer long-range combat over hand-to-hand.
I'm just a little, say, confuzzled that he's doing all these sick flips and tricks and dragging the Megazord across the ground. Both of them are really, really cool, don't get me wrong. I'm just kinda curious about this. But don't worry, the fight still has plenty of other things to love about it. This sword fight is awesome! Nothing but clean animation that feels fluid and weighty, capturing the low-budget feel of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, but not too much to where the animation is jank. Following into, like I said, the scene where Voltron drags the Megazord across the ground and yeets him into a mountain. That feels so powerful. Almost as powerful as this.
Give him covering fire!
With what?
Everything!
Absolute chills. And I haven't even talked about the part where Pidge is genuinely afraid of Lance getting ripped right from Voltron. And I love how he just outright punches the Megazord all by himself, without any of the other pilots helping him. They were right to say Pidge was unhinged. And then the death ends with one of the most dynamic looking poses in death battle history, just straight up. But I guess if I had to pull out one last pedantic criticism, they calced a black hole at 3 teratons. That's not planet level. But at the end of the day, they still put it at planet level. This is just a certified death battle calc moment. What next? Are they gonna say something like galaxy busting is weaker than moon busting? Ah, well, let's not worry about that. This episode ruled. 85 out of 100. A couple of poor line reads, odd moments in writing, and one dumb moment in the conclusion do hold this back from being supreme, but otherwise, this is much, much, much better than the rest of the season so far. Easily the best milestone episode. You had Natsu fight a One Piece character, yet it wasn't Luffy? Really? Fair enough. I did hear that this matchup was also pretty popular back in the day, even if it was in a sort of Ghost Rider versus Lobo kind of thing. Natsu's analysis was pretty cool. Lots of dragons will pique my attention no matter what. The fake-out transition leading into Zeref's role in the story was a nice twist for a rundown, though I have heard that this is a lot of spoilers that they don't even give a spoiler warning for. Oops. I still found it really cool though. Natsu will always be an epic character for me for one reason and one reason only.
His greatest weakness is how easily he gets motion sick. Put him on a moving car or boat and he'll be hurling in a matter of seconds.
Never mind my sense of direction. My motion sickness? It is that bad. Anyways, Ace's analysis is interesting because the transition they use is completely different and they start with the One Piece opening. I guess this was what made his rundown better to me because unlike Natsu's, where they kinda stop going over story beats, Ace's analysis starts with his origin, then to the versus stuff, and then back to story stuff, where they actually give a spoiler warning this time. Not sure why Natsu's analysis couldn't have one, but okay. I didn't find the jokes all that funny, as one has poor delivery and the other has the wrong delivery. But enough about that, we gotta talk about the fight and how Ace proudly eats the bone of the chicken he's eating. Lol. Oh, and apparently he's voiced by Valentine Skokes. Yes, that Valentine Skokes. And this was before the reverse Flash meme, so it feels kind of cathartic, not gonna lie, Wiz. It's kind of impossible for me to not hear reverse Flash coming out of Ace. That's more of my fault, though, I will admit. Meanwhile, you have Natsu voiced by Natsu. Yes, sir! Unfortunately, this fight doesn't have too much to talk about, but I would like to mention that there are a lot of unique shots here. Some of it is pixel art, and some of it looks like it was ripped straight from the anime, I guess. And there are a couple of weird looking shots, namely for Ace, but the majority of pixel art, masked anime clips, and hand-drawn shots look really good, with this shot of Ace being my favorite. All of these shots were made by Jerky, who's actually done a lot more hand-drawn shots for other episodes than you might think. And if I'm correct, this was his first run, and since a lot of them look really nice and flow with the fight really well, I'm very happy that Jerky would keep making shots like this. And while I did say this shot of Ace was my favorite, the best one objectively is easily the kill. Ace's body being disintegrated and his eyes being torn from his head. Wow!
All's well that ends well.
Not sure what he meant by that, but the poor guy also gets kicked out of the restaurant he dematerialized in. Overall, it's a fine episode. Maybe not one I'll want to come back to, but one that I was happy to revisit for this video. It even has a rare moment of Boomstick actually complimenting Wiz on the pun he came up with. So that alone deserves at least a decent score. 64 out of 100. The most straightforward score I can give to a straightforward episode. I still like this one. Okay, so admittedly, this episode is surprisingly weird for me to talk about. I technically have a really special connection to this episode. You wouldn't expect that from me. It's a fighting game episode featuring a character from a fighting game series I actively dislike, and another fighting game that I still haven't checked out yet. And I certainly didn't play it by the time the episode first aired. My connection to this comes from the fact that this episode aired on YouTube on my last day of high school. Yeah, I'm serious. I did enjoy high school that much, and when I got back from my last day, watching this episode was literally the first thing I did. Of course, I haven't seen that episode since that day, and there's probably a reason for that, but maybe it'll be like Fox vs. Bucky where I still love it in spite of its flaws? Well, let's find out. Sub-Zero was a massive request, and some of his requested opponents were Ryu, for some reason, Iceman, and his most popular opponent, Elsa. Elsa vs. Jin Kisaragi makes way more sense, but Nervous Nick suggested Glacius because he's a really big fan of Killer Instinct. I've heard Glacius vs. Rundus works better, and I do like that matchup, but let's not put down this episode just because a better matchup exists. After all, I outspokenly appreciate Ryu vs. Scorpion as an episode, despite finding the matchup to be insanely boring, and the characters having virtually nothing to do with each other aside from... How many times do I have to talk about this whole rivalry nonsense? I'm pretty sure I've made my point 5 times over. Sub-Zero's analysis was just a worse version of Scorpion's to me. They skimmed through his story, got to his feats and fatalities, and then shoehorned an ending note about his alliance with Scorpion featuring dragons. I do like the gamertag joke though, and I wish that the polar bear bit went somewhere, but I couldn't get too much from this one. Glacius' analysis is about as interesting, but it does have better jokes. Like the nerd joke tangent was decent, Boomstick saying, "How many licks does it take to get to the center?" and saying that he looks like a popsicle made me do that noise. But for some reason, that's where his analysis ends. Sure, why not? But anyways, on to the fights. Oh, hey, Samus, you left your ship here for some reason. And a lot of people say that this episode is completely borderline 5 out of 10 stuff. Well, can someone explain to me why this Glacius combo looks really choppy? I mean, I think it's because the clones he has barely show up during this part, so it looks really unnerving and unnatural to me. But I still want to see your explanation. Bring it up in the comments. Be as creative and maybe even insane as you can. Also, the combo breaker was really quiet for some reason. Sub-Zero slicing through the snowflakes. Yeah, they pretty much are snowflakes at this point. And then tossing one of them at Glacius. Okay, that was cool, even if it has no impact. This fight has a lot more jank than I remember. That's very season 1. In fact, that's this whole episode. It's very season 1 in season 4, where fighting game episodes like Ken vs. Terry and Ryu vs. Scorpion came before this. But then again, it's better than Ragnar vs. Soul in every conceivable way, so clearly it's not the worst ever, even if this juggling scene seems to forget what gravity looks like. But then we get to the death, and... oh crap, I completely forgot to say anything about the death. This is probably the one thing I'll defend about the episode. I don't get where people got the idea that they were trying to hide the fact that Sub-Zero actually did survive Glacius's, absorption? Liquefaction? Okay, I genuinely can't remember, because I'm too stupid to write a fucking script! But you can see Sub-Zero activating his Ice Clone ability. We've seen Death Battle do fake outs plenty of times. I don't see how this is in any way similar to them. So, does this mean I like the death? I mean, only if you have enough rupees. Yes, I'm gonna end it like that because I got nothing to say for script and I suck ANOBs at improv because fuck off you, as Nemesis Bloodreich says in every single one of his videos for some reason. I mean, sorry, but it's not even that cool of a phrasing, but 40 out of 100. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Android 18 versus Captain Marvel is what happens when you let the Death Battle fan and wiki pick a matchup. I mean, it has all the signs. Forced connections that aren't super accurate to the characters? Yep. Vaguely similar feats and abilities? Yep. Comic book Herald versus non-comic book not Herald? Even though the non-comic book not Herald wins, but shh. But this episode actually does have a few things worth talking about. The first one is that this is one of, if not the only time, where Ben Singer has admitted to making some mistakes. One was a miscalculation of Android 18's speed, which you can find in the episode's pinned comment, and another one was the whole Android 18 can absorb energy thing. People have called him out for this and even showed this scan of Trunks saying that Android 18 straight up cannot absorb energy, which Ben did defend by saying that 18 had the same designs as other androids who could absorb energy, but he mainly used Xenoverse. Compositing that doesn't need to exist. My favorite. Though to Ben's credit, he did take another look at this interpretation and publicly stated that it was wrong. In a deleted tweet, yes, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was because so many people were using this against him. Because wow! Some of you people have like no social awareness, I swear. But I think this is a good time to go into the whole compositing thing. I understand why people don't like composites. And even if they've been getting a lot better at it now, especially with episodes literally dedicated to specific versions of characters, I consider compositing to be a major problem when you composite one character, but not the other. And that's kind of what they did here. And another thing to point out is that this is the first of 3 episodes to be made during the move into Rooster Teeth's headquarters. This isn't another dark period like what Season 2 had, for example, but this still slightly hindered the quality of 3 episodes. In fact, Ben outright says that the animation wasn't negatively affected at all, but he does say that the writing may have suffered during this time period. And yeah, going into 18's analysis, I can totally see that, as the pacing feels really weird. The finger blasted joke was unfunny and went on for too long, and they spend so much time talking about the factors of breaking Super Saiyan Vegeta's arms. Who cares? You give her planet level scaling, why would you not want to go into that? And then they feel the need to go over her cold demeanor and say it's a weakness, only to say that it's a front. So why are you talking about it? I'd say that some things go on for too long, but I think this is the first time where I felt like an entire analysis was going on for too long. That's kind of sad. I guess Carol's rundown is a little better. They made her superhero origin interesting with the blacking out and all. It gets to the point much better, though the ending feels abrupt as Wiz's last line doesn't feel like an ending note. But hopefully the animation is better. I have high hopes because after a long hiatus, Zach Watkins returns to Death Battle, and he still animates the series' Sprite episodes to this very day, albeit with some help from other Sprite animators like Luis Cruz, for example. And once again, he brought with him his talent for giving episodes a great sense of speed, and that makes the first half a lot of fun. The part where they hit each other with the same attack, that's a cool moment, and 18 pulling her hair leads to a fun exchange with intentionally jank animation. I mean, I just can't get enough of this. But then we get to the second half, and Binary looks so bad, you guys. Ugh. Almost as jarring as these 2 pixels. Oh, mama. This part of the fight isn't really bad, it just feels slower than the first half. I mean, that part had this really cool bit where there's just a couple of lines, and 18 is literally running circles around Carol. Not only does it feel fast, but also has a really nice sense of anticipation. But I mean, we do get a pretty cool moment of 18 breaking Carol's arms and then killing her by stepping in Loser. And going into the conclusion, despite the whole energy absorbing thing that people still criticize this episode for, they barely bring it up at all, beyond apparently Carol's isn't as good as she thinks it is. But even then, their words are that 18 is no stranger to this ability. You could interpret this as her being familiar with this type of technique, since, as Ben says, she has the same designs as other androids who are able to absorb energy. So it is nice to know that it doesn't really affect the outcome that much. Unfortunately, the conclusion still sucks. They give 18 planetary scaling offhandedly, but they directly state multiple times that Carol has star levels of power and is comparable to white holes. So with all of this in mind, we have 2 analyses that bore me to sleep, a fight that has a great first half and a semi-weaker second half, and an odd conclusion that is wrong by its own logic. 53 out of 100. Heads up, there is an episode later down the line that has this episode's original score, and by virtue this episode actually dropped by a good amount, but we'll get there when we get there. Ah yes, Louise's first episode as the lead 2D animator. I feel like as a matchup, Metal Sonic vs. Zero would have worked better as a Season 1 episode, a la Zitz vs. Leonardo. You know, given that this could be interpreted as Eggman vs. Wily, who gets the last laugh. but it's in Season 4, although there is absolutely no problem with that. Let's see how this goes. Metal Sonic's analysis has a pretty good running gag, with Boomstick making some metal band names from Metal Sonic's attacks. Those are pretty good, but unfortunately I have a bunch of issues with this. The first one being the Boomstick ex-wife jokes. Okay, hot take, but the Boomstick ex-wife jokes are worse than the Boomstick dad jokes in every conceivable way. I get that the Boomstick dad jokes are technically more infamous, and maybe they are more prominent, but at the very least, there's a reason why their jokes are being made in the first place, and also they have been funny at least a few times in the past. But with the Boomstick ex-wife jokes, they can just appear whenever the they want to, and it's just a hacky cop-out for what could have been a more interesting line, be it an adequate joke or a more interesting tidbit, but no, it's just Boomstick saying, "But my ex-wife though!" That's not funny, that's just lazy. And also, I don't think they've ever been funny. I think the closest we've got to a chuckle out of me was the one from Deadpool vs. Deathstroke, where Boomstick is outright offended by Deadpool having a crush on Boomstick's ex-wife. But even then, I didn't chuckle actually. Then again, we haven't seen the worst of the Boomstick dad jokes yet, so maybe that opinion will change. Who knows? But at this point, I'm genuinely surprised that the Boomstick ex-wife jokes don't get as much hate as they do, because when they show up, I actually groan. I got a couple of other issues with this, mainly in the music. The rundown does have Fight the Night, which is a bass choice, as Sonic and the Black Knight has the real best Sonic soundtrack. Don't at me. Unless if you want me to make a video on that, I think I should really do that, shouldn't I? Feel free to leave a comment saying yes or whatever. But they also play Eggman's theme from Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, that cartoon, and the Wave Ocean Inlet theme. Why? These don't make Metal Sonic come across as like a deadly threat like what they describe him as. Not even close. And going into Zero's analysis, I'm sorry, but I had issues with this one as well. Mainly with this.
For some reason, Zero's stasis pod also contained a mysterious virus. The virus infected Sigma and, for some reason, swapped Sigma and Zero's morality alignments.
Sorry, but that's not what happened. Zero was analyzed by Dr. Kane, who removed the virus within him. You could argue that this is me criticizing the episode for outside factors. If these don't bother you, or if you think that way, that's perfectly valid. But in my opinion, a big part of the character rundowns is trying to analyze their story, what they do in the world, how they exist in the first place, etc., etc. And if they get something wrong about it, I think it's perfectly fair to criticize Death Battle for it, since that is what they're trying to do. Think of it as criticizing a combatant being blatantly out of character, if you will. But as for other issues I had, they're admittedly more minor than in Metal Sonic's analysis. I mean, the music they play at least makes sense. But they say that Absolute Zero is stronger and faster than Black Zero, but they have the same strength increases, and Absolute Zero only has a 50% speed increase. Maybe I'm just thinking about this wrong and it's like stacked, but I don't know, it just didn't feel like that was communicated to me. Also, you say that Zero has all of these abilities and you only list 5 of them. Is that all you got? But with all that said, Zero's analysis was still okay. And I do like the Robot Freaky Friday joke. And the reference to Mega Man Zero. Absolutely based. But as for the fight, okay. Full disclosure, I completely ran out of sugar, so I actually have nothing to coat it with. But anyone who's familiar with my second channel, shoutouts to the people who are, will probably remember me saying that I used to hate this fight back then, almost as much as I currently hate Ragna vs. Soul. Ooh, that definitely does not send a good impression, does it? Is it really that bad? Well, in some ways, kinda? Let's talk about the one thing everyone criticizes this episode for, the sound design. People are really obsessed with saying that Hulk vs. Broly has bad sound design. I'll hold my comments until I revisit that episode properly, but I guarantee that it's impossible for it to be even 0.5% close to this level of bad. It checks off all of the boxes. Missing sound effects? Wrong sound effects? Sound effects that desperately need some extra layers? Attacks that just straight up have no impact? Yeah, you pretty much see this kind of stuff throughout the entire fight, except for like 2 moments where this building in the background is destroyed, and the part where Metal Sonic is dashing through the F-Zero cars. Oh, and there's also these ugly 3D models. I don't think I need to tell you why these look bad, although to be fair, I do think most of Metal's look alright. Oh, and the Metal Overlord shot looks great. But at the same time, I'm just trying to figure out what purpose they even serve. I guess there's the argument that this episode was trying to capture the old school gaming vibe, because as we all know, Death Battle has never tried to go for that vibe in the past, not in any other season, and especially not in this season. But if that's not it, then what purpose do these even serve? I guess maybe it had something to do with Louise being the sole animator, but they're actually much worse than you'd realize, with the worst moment being this Rakoha. So, the way that Rakoha works is that Zero punches the ground and then a bunch of lasers fall from the sky. But here's the thing. This 3D model section completely ruins it because it creates the illusion that he's punching the air horizontally instead of the ground because it gives the exact same perspective. I can't even bring myself to appreciate the ending. Sure, I think the concept is pretty cool, and the use of color grading is kinda neat, but this ugly 3D model completely takes me out of it. Zero's walk cycle looks unfinished, and what happened to your eyes, my dude? And why are they leaking onto the rest of your face? Was there just not enough time to finish these or something? And what would this even add compared to a simple shot of Zero's sprite just closing his eyes? And that's my issue with these 3D models. They're not just ugly, they serve no purpose. Other hand-drawn shots have been used to highlight a key moment in a fight, whether it's before a super powerful attack, a transformation sequence, or some other highlight. I can't think of a single reason why these 3D models even exist, aside from Metal Overlord. Not only is it the only time where it looks good, but it also has a purpose, that being to help emphasize the Metal Overlord transformation, and also give it a good sense of scale, but that's literally the only smart use of these 3D models. And even then, I think that Metal Overlord is more hand-drawn in this shot. Meanwhile, you're telling me that Zero firing a simple charge shot and having this much recoil was worthy of its own 3D model section? In fact, why is he flinching? Zero, the robot who was designed to be better than the original Mega Man in every way, can't seem to fire a slightly more powerful pea shooter without this much recoil. Seriously? In fact, looking at these faces now, it gives me the impression that he's being portrayed as a fucking rookie. That is not a good look. You might think that's the only problem this episode has, but actually, you'd be surprised as to how much more is wrong with this episode. Like, yeah, the sense of speed is great, the use of squash and stretch and smear frames are used excellently here, but aside from that, man, there's some really not great looking shots. Like, there's this part where Zero starts panting after taking a limp-ass plasma pulse laser. Why are you panting? That didn't even hurt you. And I guess there are a couple of unique exchanges of abilities, and Neo Metal Sonic gets an appearance. For a whole 2 seconds where he shows up and transforms into Metal Overlord, knowing that his previous episode got to do a lot more. Sorry for wanting a fight dynamic that doesn't rush through everything for no reason. Absolute Zero's onslaught is literally unanimated. He's barely even tweening! And Metal Overlord's delayed reaction to it is the exact same scene from Strange Fate, except they forgot the funny! Man, I think I was kinda onto something, because you know what I'm gonna give this episode? 29 out of 100. Yes, that is a lower score than Venom versus Bane. In hindsight, I didn't even have that much trouble deciphering what was going on. Believe it or not, at least that episode was able to maintain a distinct identity. And it did stand out for the right, albeit mostly for the wrong reasons, but at least I can admire this episode having a different tone and vibe from most other episodes. I can't say that about Metal Sonic vs. Zero. It's a fight that tries way too hard to stand out because of some questionable animation choices, and a fight dynamic that feels extremely rushed. But you know what? Let's pretend that the sound design is adequate and that the 3D models were replaced with functional sprites. What else are you even left with here? Good choreography? I mean, it is competent, but there's not a whole lot to talk about barring the sense of speed. Some unique interactions? I mean, yeah, but there's only like 3 of them, and one of them is for the kill, and the other one is with 2 of their special weapons lethargically charging towards one another. A fight that pays homage to the lack of technical polish that these games apparently used to have? Okay, even if we ignore how these games actually hold up extremely well, or at least way better than you'd think, why the hell would you want to pay homage to that of all things? If it's for a single line of dialogue or one funny moment, that's fine, but not for an entire episode. Didn't Mewtwo vs. Shadow get criticized for doing this exact thing? I'm no stranger to intentional jank that's played for a joke. I really just said that like Metal Sonic vs. Zero was supposed to be a joke episode when it's not. But either way, it's meant to be obvious when jank animation or lack of technical polish is intentional. Where do you see that here? Zero's models look like they're from the PS1 days, and Metal Sonic I'm having trouble deciding if it's supposed to be 16-bit or 8-bit. They don't clash with one another because you never see the two 3D models in the same screen, well, aside from like right here, in which case, yeah, I do think they kind of clash. But I digress. This is the exact same bad faith argument I've seen people use to defend Jason versus Michael's poor choreography and storytelling. How do you expect that to be much better here? I don't see a consistent aesthetic or art style. I don't see anything that could imply a low-budget charm. All I see is an episode that tries way too hard to be really, really cool, but ends up looking about as janky as a Season 1 episode in 2017, when they're clearly trying to make the episode look better than previous episodes of previous seasons. Adding things like a higher sense of speed, higher quality standout shots, and a kill that's trying to flex their big boy budget. I mean, I guess I don't have much of a reason to be too harsh on this episode, given that Louise was the sole animator aside from some help from Jerky. And again, this was during the move to Austin, but at the same time, this is easily the sloppiest episode of the entire show. And yes, I remember the entirety of Season 1. And yes, I know what episodes are on their way, but I still stand by this. Zero versus Meta Knight when? There is a timeline where Lucario vs. Renamon was the Season 2 finale. Cry about it. In all seriousness, they did try to make this one stand out from Charizard vs. Agumon. Ben chose not to include evolutions, mega evolutions, digivolutions, etc. to make it a closer fight. I have heard an argument how this would technically mean Lucario would start off as Riolu, but at the same time, from what I know, you can still find Lucarios by themselves in, like, mountains, for example. They do say that there is evidence of the two characters being able to evolve on their own, but given that the only time Lucario could mega evolve by himself was in Smash Brothers, it's probably best to not use evolutions. And you'd think that because of that there wouldn't be too much to bring up in the analysis, but there actually is. They both have a nice touch of them analyzing the combatants as the species rather than any specific Lucario or Renamon. And you have all sorts of other moments in Lucario's analysis, like being privileged enough to have its own movie, and having the same voice and fighting style as Goku. And in Renamon's analysis, they point out some parallels to Japanese folklore. That's pretty cool. And I like Wiz saying Renamon is better than Boomstick. That is pretty based, not gonna lie, Wiz. And then the fucking Windows XP error window. Windows XP error window. Yes, that is actually what it's written here. After Boomstick making a cringy pun. They also poke fun at the lame Digimon move names, and it's actually a really fun analysis that I enjoyed quite a- Hey, this Google search better not go where I think it's going. They show a sexualized image. Uncensored. Yet they censor other following images, but for some reason, not this. I'm gone, bye. Okay, even if I actually did leave, I wouldn't be missing too much because this fight is just 1 minute and 40 seconds of white noise with barely anything interesting happening. That's actually pretty generous because of the nearly 30-second long intro. Renamon is the only character that has a voice, and I'd assume that it's because of the team's move to Austin, so I won't be too harsh on it. It's not like Marissa Lenti gives a bad performance or anything. It's actually pretty good. And of course, the death is amazing, though Lucario powering through the Diamond Storm has a couple of issues in terms of audio balancing. His scream is just too quiet for my liking, and it doesn't have the impact I remember it having. And Renamon's "Are you kidding me?" breaks the pacing and doesn't sound like she's shocked that much. And the conclusion is flawed, but not in the way that you think. They say that Lucario could only keep up in short bursts, but he was blitzing Renamon throughout the entire first half with extreme speed. They also say that Lucario's base arsenal was more than enough to overwhelm Renamon, but Lucario only uses extreme speed, Force Palm which did nothing, Aura Sphere, Bone Rush, and an Aura Storm, a Smash Bros. Exclusive move that Renamon just outright avoids. Meanwhile, Renamon uses Palm Strike, Power Paw, 2 Diamond Storms, and Rapid Kick that have more meaningful impact than anything Lucario does. Also, where were Lucario's self-healing and stat-boosting abilities? Those weren't shown anywhere in the fight. Man, this season has not been good so far. 36 out of 100, that is pitiful. I'ma keep it real with you. It was at this point where I was genuinely about to quit Death Battle entirely. Aside from the one episode I thought was really good and the one episode I thought was decent, every single one just felt like fluff. Plain old filler that just straight up doesn't excite me. So if they couldn't keep me engaged, then why should I even keep watching Death Battle to begin with? However, in the midst of a mediocre season, when all of my interest in Death Battle was weakening, along came the salvation to raise my interest from the dead in the form of the best goddamn episode of the season. This episode is art. And it was a request that came from Nick and Torian. Though they wanted to apply boxing rules to it, Ben turned it down, but they came up with a compromise. Not only did he get to include some moves that they have from their games, but he also got to hit up a few friends who were boxers to help him with animating the choreography. But man, this episode has some of the most engaging rundowns, period. Analyzing them as actual boxers and comparing them to real-life boxers, which makes sense given that they were both inspired by them. And when you look at the connections, it isn't just they are fighting game boxers, but it also has something to do with cheating and an interesting contrast in what they took with it. And there is no race connection! Thank you! Balrog's analysis even comes with some good jokes like the gag about the elephants on Dalsum's stage and the shed in the tool fumble with Boomstick saying, "You're a tool!" The way that they talk about Balrog's upbringing to escape the slums only to turn it into a life of gambling, cheating, and even killing a man in his career. Oh, let's keep that in mind, because I want to talk about TJ's analysis. I'm just gonna say it, best rundown of the series. Easy. They cover his boxing career more in depth, making me feel for him when he got exposed by Ultratech after beating Fulgore. They also have the Goofy movie reference, which was pretty cute, and even a callback to the very first Death Battle Q&A.
Is that how you got your nickname, Boomstick?
Nickname? What the hell are you talking about?
How did you get the nickname Boomstick?
Nickname?
And shout out to the music choices here. They have some solid Killer Instinct music playing in the background, but it also contains the best use of music in a death battle analysis. A warrior's journey playing during the part where they talk about TJ's downfall is a more effective choice of music than some entire death battle fight scenes. And then they have Back to Rise playing, the instrumental version, thank you, when they start talking about his comeback. Truth be told, this feels less like a character analysis and more like a summary of a Rocky film. And speaking as someone who really likes the Rocky movies as well as the Creed films, this made them even better for me. And that's not even getting into the fight. Whew, let's talk about this. Look, I'm no boxer, but they're utilizing their boxer techniques extremely well. Balrog's tree trunk arms look really powerful, TJ's mobility looks swift, and the use of their games' respective sound design is top notch. And even though the models are in different styles, they don't look like they clash with one another. I think that might have something to do with the game's excellent use of lighting. Yes, you do have the civilians all in black, but not gonna lie, that kind of adds to the charm and style of this episode, where it feels like an actual boxing match, complete with dedicated intros that actually tell their stories differently just with their lackeys alone. And that's to say nothing of the glorious looking attack trails in their attacks. Of course, the first half of this fight is pretty good, nothing bad, but nothing spectacular. Until Balrog straight up kills the referee. And this is where all hell breaks loose. Balrog starts fighting dirty the moment he's at a noteworthy disadvantage, and then they start using their fighting game mechanics. TJ using more of his special moves, including his shoot toss, Balrog using his V trigger and V reversal, TJ busting out the combo breaker, and Balrog using his critical art from Street Fighter V, complete with the exact voice clips used, which yes, don't exactly fit with Balrog's voice actor for this episode, but it's the only time they play the voice clip from one of their games. They even start breaking the arena just by the strength of their punches. This is even more impactful when you remember their rundowns diving into their history with how they'll both want to become or remain the boxing champ. But while one boxer takes no issues with fighting dirty, the other one genuinely wants to redeem himself. And this leads into the best part of the episode. Come on, you know the words. 3 little words.
I ain't done!
Alright, let me explain to you why this moment single-handedly makes this episode better than Dante versus Bayonetta. TJ is yet again the underdog of this fight, with the added touch of Balrog slamming his fist during the fist bump, showing that he doesn't care for sportsmanship at all. It starts off with Balrog casually shrugging off TJ's punches, literally not flinching. But TJ does find the upper hand, and yes, TJ does do some trash talking as well, but it's in the underdog type of way where he's saying, "You act like you're top dog, why aren't you proving it to me?" Or something like that. And Balrog uses Dirty Bull to turn the tides, forcing TJ to give it his all and start pulling out some better moves himself. And then Balrog uses his Gigaton Blow to punch his lights out. Literally, look at all these lights! This is straight up from a Rocky movie, I swear. But TJ's sheer drive to prove himself pulls through in one last rise. Oh, and look at how they massacred Balrog's arm! And listen to his little squeal of pain! And then we get to the final kill where he's going all out.
Holy jumping giblets!
And then we get to the conclusion, and yes, one could say that this was an extremely close match. And yeah, I have heard that the triangle theory does have its flaws, but let's think about what this means thematically. One argument that they make is that TJ wins via using the same skills as the very boxer that inspired him, which technically didn't have as much emphasis as Balrog did in his rundown. Besides, you could prove that the triangle theory applies to this situation if you claim that TJ is faster. I mean, I guess they don't give either character anything for speed, but if nothing else, they say that TJ's Berserker mode allows him to move faster, which is vague, but still technically more than what they gave Balrog. But then again, that's just a hypothesis.
A game hypothesis.
This episode does have some issues, like how Balrog's hoodie keeps clipping through his body multiple times, and the fight does have some small positioning issues that, to be fair, are kinda tough to notice. But that's the bar we're setting here. Oh, and are we just gonna ignore the fact that TJ's theme plays throughout the entire fight pretty much? And yet we're still gonna criticize Yang vs Tifa for this reason? Whatever. Unlike Yang vs Tifa, Back to Rise is like a perfect track for this fight, especially with how it fits the fight in ways you wouldn't expect. If nothing else, I do think this episode has a better use of music than Snake vs. Sam. Yeah, Divine Identity is probably the best track that they've ever used for an episode, aside from MK Elise from Tony vs. Lex, but at the same time, I don't think it's worth ignoring that the Anarchy Reigns music they go with for this episode really doesn't fit as well as you might think. But still, this episode single-handedly made me a fan of the show again, during a time where I was so close to quitting the show entirely. 99 out of 100. Let's hope that they can maintain this level of quality throughout the remainder of the season. Following up the previous masterpiece, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. Oh, wait, I just forgot I ran out of sugar. Hang on, I'll be back. Yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. This episode is about 2% worse than Balrog vs TJ combo. This was where Death Battle started using royalty-free music. Notice how I said that instead of saying original tracks, because for one, multiple previous episodes had original tracks, in spite of how simplistic they were. And for two, the next episode didn't have an original track for the matchup. It used royalty-free music throughout the entire thing. But enough about that, because holy goodness, the Shredder! A Ninja Turtles character that's not a Ninja Turtle! And his analysis was a lot of fun, taking some modest jabs at the 1987 series Shredder, the 90s live-action movies, and the musical, but still focusing on the coolest parts about him. And I also liked quite a bit of the jokes here, like Boomstick doing a science.
That's true, Boomstick.
Are you sure you don't mean that's right, Boomstick? I mean, it does kind of have the same compositing problem that both Season 1 TMNT episodes had, but to be fair, they at least acknowledge that there are different versions of Shredder, even if that's technically untrue, but they mainly focus on the 2012 series in terms of covering his origins and feats. If you had to composite a character in the analysis, this is how you do it. Acknowledging that different versions exist, but still focusing on the strength of one of them. Oh, and Silver Samurai's analysis was a lot more fun than I remember as well. I like the joke of Boomstick being hypocritical with insensitivity, with Wiz saying that Harada's a bastard by definition, and then Boomstick calls him a mutant, as Wiz says.
Now who's being insensitive?
Imagine if Death Battle had more Wiz and Boomstick banter like this. Hell, even Boomstick calling him Silver Samurai. That's my best impression of it. How does he say it?
A Silver Samurai!
Yeah, I thought that was pretty humorous. Though the moment they start talking about Wolverine is the moment that the analysis starts to tell a really engaging story. It actually goes really hard with how they cover how vengeful he becomes of him, but instead of using it to cover some revenge plot he develops or something, it's used to focus on his drive to improve himself, which compels Wiz to naturally transition into his feats. That is clean writing right there. But how good is the fight? I mean, the YouTube chapters say it's dirt, so how do you think? The setup's okay. Harada's honing his skills by destroying trees, and then Shredder and his Foot Clan just show up out of nowhere. I mean, I guess I can forgive it because, ooh, this shot looks dynamic, wow! And after that, the fight has some of the best sense of speed ever. As fast as Season 2 episodes would get, this one surpasses all of them to me, aside from maybe Ryu vs. Hiryu. But even then, it's not that big of a gap, especially during the smoke cloud scene where they're literally dodging each other's attacks, but then Harada finds an opening off the reflection of his sword. That is rad. I'd also like to give a shout out to the scene where Shredder is hopping along the trees and then he turns his back to see Harada chopping down the entire forest. Yes, okay, that is epic. Even if the setup is a little weak in my opinion, if it needed to be there to justify how fast he's going and chopping down these trees, I approve. Even the scene where Harada is looking for Shredder in the smoke cloud scene feels very fast. And all that's technically happening is that the sprites are hard cutting perspectives, with the background just zooming behind him. Once we get to Super Shredder, the fight has a slower sense of speed, but that's to emphasize how powerful of an opponent he's become. You also have shots like Harada cutting through a lightning bolt, which sets the whole forest on fire, creating a menacing atmosphere perfect for the death. In fact, let's talk about this. For the most viewed part of the episode, it needs time dedicated to it. So after Harada's helmet falls off, the music just cuts off completely, selling the atmosphere even more. If this was a modern death battle episode, they'd probably have the music keep going. But we all know the shot that makes this death stand out. This one right here. You see this glow in Shredder's eye? Pay attention to how it's popping up as he crushes Harada's head. Even if you look at the fire behind him, it gets brighter and brighter as Harada's head is being crushed further and further. Combined with the slow buildup of the screen shake effect, the anime speed lines, and that crunchy sound design. Man, Jerky went too hard on this. Can we all just normalize acknowledging Jerky's efforts on the show and praising him more often in every episode he works on? Please say yes, because I fail to see why the answer should be no. I mean, come on, he's still the only one making these shots. Give my man some respect! But anyways, all that's left to say is that the outro clip references the ending of Harada's analysis. Heh. And I like how the conclusion is focused on the speed of the two combatants and how the fight could land with one fatal hit. I mean, yeah, there are people who say that the one combo does take away from it a little bit, but to be fair, listen to their exact words they use.
They only needed to land one fatal hit to finish the fight. One fatal hit, one fatal hit, fatal hit, fatal hit.
They're saying one fatal hit as opposed to just one hit. And Shredder's combo consists of some basic kicks and an uppercut, which in its base form are definitely not fatal. Man, this episode is amazing! I'm gonna give it a 90 out of 100. No Supreme? Well, that's because there is one major issue with the episode that I didn't want to talk about. While Super Shredder was great, the transformation is kinda terrible, not gonna lie, Wiz. I don't like the angle of this shot, the transformation has some weak sound design, and Harada does his best impression of surprised Captain America, which is not a good thing, as it's not even a good impression. But that's it. That's really the only big issue this episode has. This was a joke episode 3 years in the making. This episode's entire existence literally comes up to some fan asking, "Hey, do Smokey versus McGruff!" at a convention, and then Ben and Chad just saying, "Oh sure, we'll do it." But this episode's production wasn't bad, but it's a reason why no one should ever do this and why Death Battle would never do this ever. Originally, Ben was the head of this episode in 2015, then Nick was in charge of it the following year, and then it got pushed over to Sam. But going into the episode, the first half of Smokey's analysis was fine. Nothing special, but nothing bad. Although I do like the reference to Smokey's actual wife at the National Zoo. But things start becoming funnier when they show Smokey outright getting annoyed by the 90s cheesiness and the bear pun counter. On paper, it's just a decent joke, but the fact that Wiz would be the one to make a pun out of Ursus being Latin for bear, that is definitely something Wiz would do. And then we get into McGruff's analysis, and I didn't think that it was as fun. Not even the stupid drug cassette tape album was funny to me. It's still a good analysis, don't get me wrong, I just wish it was funnier. That's how most people think about the fight, but somehow I'm not one of those people. Technically being the first hand-drawn episode, Death Battle collabed with Blind Ferret, and thankfully they would work with them on one other episode, but we'll get there when we get there. First of all, I want to say that I really like these designs. Aside from Smokey's face looking weird at times, they look really good in the fight, they're animated fluidly enough, and there's a balance between them working like realistic combatants and being as cartoony as possible, especially with all the wackier abilities they use later on. And I like how these custom designs of Smokey and McGruff were in the thumbnail, but the fight has some amusing moments like McGruff talking about the forest fire as it's burning the forest, which actually ties into the weakness as how McGruff does nothing when he's giving lectures. That is brilliant, not gonna lie. And then they start throwing hands, and okay, I don't like these animations, but the Hanna-Barbera sound effects being played ironically, it doesn't always work for me, as there are a couple of weird uses of them, like the Flintstones running sound effect playing when there's nothing moving on screen. But otherwise, for what they did with them, I thought it was enjoyable enough. In fact, McGruff kind of steals the show for me. I mean, he's one of, if not the only character who has unironically weaponized the term,
"I'll show you respect."
And then when McGruff freezes time, he does the "guess I'll die" meme. You love it! And it's built up with his speech being long enough to where you think he's gonna say something, and then he just does the meme. That's brilliant.
Remember, kids, if you have the power to manipulate time but you can't do anything with it, start by doing the easiest thing, which is an ad break, like this.
そして脇はもぎ出す。
And then at the end of the fight, when they alter their catchphrases for the context of combat, that's comedic perfection. And then we have quite possibly the greatest ending line in all of Death Battle.
Remember, kids. Remember me.
God bless Chris Rager. I kinda wish that the conclusion went for a mock thematic victory, given that Smokey is able to interact with other people in his time freeze, unlike McGruff. Or at the very least, give us something like a parody of Goku vs. Superman's conclusion. I guess Goku vs. Superman 2 unintentionally parodied. That's not a criticism, just something I personally wanted to see. After all, Boomstick gets one last bear pun and Wiz admits defeat. Perfect. I get why this episode doesn't have that much love in the Death Battle community. Not that they think it's bad, they just don't think it's that funny. So I was worried about how much I would like this episode because I knew it was gonna be worse than the last joke episode. I'm still happy to say it's better than I remember, and not too far behind. 75 out of 100. My only issue is that McGruff's analysis isn't that great to me. Now this is where Death Battle fights exclusively use original music. Only this time, instead of commissioning Brandon Yates again, they hired Theirwolf Media. And whenever they do vocal tracks, they refuse to give the instrumental versions of them for some f***ing reason. Brandon, why don't you do this anymore? You used to do this all the time, and I know for a fact that you still have access to the instrumental versions, so what's stopping you aside from nothing? This was also the first Returner versus Returner episode. And like with Balrog versus TJ and Shredder versus Silver Samurai, I was super excited for this one. Especially since, let's be real, the matchup they got in Season 1 weren't exactly amazing. I mean, Rogue versus Wonder Woman is only slightly more thematic than Ivy versus Orchid, but that's such a nothing accomplishment. And Thor versus Raiden is literally just Thunder God, and I guess the matchup was popular back then, but now everyone and their mother considers it to be one of, if not the biggest stomp that Death Battle's ever done. But I digress. The analyses don't have a lot of jokes, but I don't think that they're necessary given the gravitas that they're going for. They're taking these combatants even more seriously than last time. I mean, they kinda have to with Diana, given that lol misogyny and sex joke were the only things they actually talked about in her analysis. That said, the few jokes they do use, I don't like too much. The Asgard joke is not funny, and no Sokka facepalm will change that, though the boomstick flex is very based. Oh, and let's not forget this iconic line.
Why did we put this guy up against Raiden again?
No one knows. But much like Wiz and Boomstick in the first episode, no one wants to stop talking about the holes that the elephants are... I'm not even gonna finish that sentence. I already did that joke in my No More Heroes 2 video, and you actively chose not to watch it for no reason. I mean, what's stopping you aside from nothing? The God Blast wasn't mentioned once. And Thor's axe was also mentioned in a sidebar, but they never discussed it in depth at any point. And they should have done that because they also directly point out Diana's weakness to piercing weapons. And given that the God Blast is Thor's most powerful attack, there's just no excuse to not reference it. They redeemed themselves in Thor's next episode, but that took like 5 years too late, I guess. But on the brighter side of things, Diana's analysis was massively better than her previous one, but again, that's a nothing accomplishment. And thankfully this was a genuinely good analysis that made Diana look like a badass, though I find the lack of feats disturbing. In fact, the one feat they use is Megatons of Force. That does not equate to fucking White Dwarf Star, you wankers. I'm pretty sure that's large building level, or at least that was my conversion, but I've heard the highest it got was continent level, and they put Thor at planet busing, so I wonder who's going to win. Anyways, aside from that, not much to really talk about. It's flawed from a versus standpoint, albeit retroactively, but we'll get there. But from every other standpoint, I liked it enough. But onto the fights. Okay, there's a lot to talk about here. So for a fight that's just hammer versus sword, this choreography is so good. The attacks feel fast and powerful, more so than other episodes at times, and the sense of scale they go to is great. There's a fight within a tornado, they blow up the moon, and I think they end up destroying Themyscira as well. Not to mention, I do think these performances are pretty decent. Jonah Scott's Thor isn't too great, but in his defense, he doesn't get a lot of lines, although there is one line read that always sticks out to me.
Feel heaven's wrath!
Ah yes, feel heaven's wrath! My favorite line from Thor Marvel Comics. But Natalie Van Sistine does a really good Diana in my opinion, giving me some Ali Hillis lightning vibes. Her line reads are definitely better than Jonah's, aside from her last line, but that's for different reasons that we'll get to in a bit because now it's time to talk about the bad stuff. Although, I can't really bring myself to go into that without bringing up the deleted scenes. Torian has been open about how much was removed from the fight because of the rendering issues, which in shots like the tornado scene, for example, the models don't look fully rendered. And that's a shame because when they're rendered well, they genuinely hold up insanely well. Yeah, they're using lower poly models from Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and Injustice 1 respectively, but thanks to the lighting, they're able to make these models look way better than they do in standard lighting, which makes it all the more jarring when the models suddenly look less detailed. And that's because with the amount of choreography Torian was going for, this was hell to render. And this is where we get into the deleted scenes, so let's go into them one by one, why don't we? Because hot take of the night, this fight literally could have been one of the best episodes of the entire show. The first deleted scene shows Thor getting the upper hand on Diana before he breaks her shield. Not a big loss, but it does make more sense than Thor being able to break her shield after getting mostly overwhelmed by Diana's superior mobility. And the next scene is a brief scuffle with Diana dodging Thor's attacks without her sword. It has some neat movement and all, but doesn't add much to the animation, so cutting it was justified. The next scene is a much longer scuffle where Diana is blocking Thor's hammer with her bracelets, featuring this shot where Thor twirls his hammer as Diana rapidly blocks every attack. And this looks awesome, but I could taste the rendering issues seeping through from here, so it makes sense why it was cut. But man, I'd be lying if I said this wouldn't have been hyped to have included. But the same scene showcases Diana kicking Thor back, dashing towards him, and throwing hands a bit before getting behind him. This sequence is cool except for the part where Diana stumbles behind Thor. The next scene has Diana flying into the air and saying, "Is that all?" which would have explained why Diana is randomly floating in the air. They tried hiding it as best they could, but now that I know what the deleted scene was, I definitely understand why it feels like a scene was missing here. And then after Thor creates the mighty tornado, there's a scene of Diana casually dodging a chunk of debris. I guess this explains the blink and you'll miss it turnaround animation that she does, but other than that, it doesn't really make it look more like a tornado, so cutting this was a smart move. And then there's an extended version of the part where Diana climbs up the debris from the tornado. On the one hand, I understand why it was cut because it kind of implies that Thor was staying still for a while, but on the other hand, I think that Diana hopping across approaching debris gives the tornado a much better sense of scale than punching across other debris. And the final deleted scene is an extended sequence of Diana's dual wielding against Mjolnir's onslaught, which while we still get enough of in the episode, it also includes a shot of Diana nimbly dodging this lightning blast. On paper, I don't think this scene should have been cut, as it's one of the only parts that incorporates their shared mobility, but at the same time, yeah. While not all of these deleted scenes add much to the fight, most of them either had some creative choreography or would help contextualize some minor odd ends. But even if you put that aside, this episode still has some other flaws, most notably with the ending. There's a very obvious cut from Diana bonking Mjolnir onto Thor with her lasso, and then Thor's randomly on the ground and he dies by a stab through the mouth. Oh, and as far as I'm concerned, Torian never showed a deleted scene for this. So as far as we know, Thor takes one hit from the planet-busting Mjolnir and then dies by stabbing. Yes, they said that Diana's sword could stab people at an atomic level, but this was not the way to communicate it. Also, I thought we established the fact that auditions for surprised Captain America closed the moment it happened. Oh, and also there's a reveal that her bracelets came off. So thanks for robbing us of a half-decent fight dynamic.
You're not worthy.
You literally called him incredible earlier in the fight, but okay. The last thing I have to say about this fight before we get into this is the track. Thunder of Wonder used to be one of my least favorite tracks, but it has been growing on me lately, especially since this was Theirwolf's first track on the show. I like how it's in 7/8 time, which is very cool, and I like Theirwolf's remix of Wonder Woman's theme from Batman vs. Superman, making the song better in my opinion. But even if I like the track more, and even if the deleted scenes were in the fight, and even if the rendering issues were fixed, nothing would save this conclusion. Personally, I do think that Diana wins, but they did a terrible job at explaining why. Yeah, they had Diana at 8,000 times stronger, but I think you forgot to give her speed a number. They did mention how she was able to tag Professor Zoom, and I know what that means because I've looked into the matchup, but to anyone not familiar with versus debating, do you know what immeasurable speed means? I mean, yeah, on paper it means speed that can't be measured, but how do you know it's impossible to measure? And how would you think Wonder Woman would get this scaling? And this is where the lack of Yarnbjorn and the whole megatons of force thing comes into play.
Mjolnir may have been tough for Diana to defend against, but it couldn't exploit her weakness to piercing weapons.
If the conclusion was written better and if all of those deleted scenes were added in, you'd at least have people saying, I disagree with the outcome, but I will admit, the fight was fantastic. People are still saying this kind of thing about Ryu vs. Jin and Dio vs. Alucard, for example, but unfortunately, no one thinks this episode's fantastic. In fact, there aren't a whole lot of words that could describe this episode, but following this revisit, I did not expect disappointing to be one of them. 62 out of 100. This episode deserved to have more time in the oven to rise like a delicious souffle. But on the other hand, I do get why they would put the research efforts into the next episode. Because this was the first episode to feature those black boxes in the analyses and conclusions that most people just kind of say they exist. Ben says that this was the most complicated match of the season, so that's probably why they were included, and I'm glad that they stuck around today. Given how they currently use black boxes, I think that they should be used to either elaborate on feats they talk about, cover other feats that don't mean too much that could involve things like scaling or support for major feats, clear up some minor misconceptions, or add some other fun fact. Honestly, the only criticism I have for this effort is that Luffy has more emphasis in the intro than Naruto or Ichigo, despite still not having an episode. Lol. Naruto's analysis was pretty good. It kinda got me interested in the character, and it even had an okay joke here and there. There were some fun moments like Wiz dissecting Naruto's run, and some compelling moments like how they brought up his son taking his place. And Boomstick still made an endearing joke about it. The way that the black boxes were used here were pretty mixed. On the one hand, the scaling to other tailed beasts was necessary to elaborate on how strong Kurama is, and the pop-ups about the clones were necessary as well. But on the other hand, the speed of lightning didn't need to be there. And as for Ichigo's analysis, this was actually a lot of information for me to take in. I know, it's weird. I'm the guy who is able to dissect BlazBlue lore of all things, yet the moment I get into bare minimum research of Bleach is the moment I start getting confuzzled. How in the hell is that possible? This is probably just a me thing, but it could also be due to how the vital stuff about Reishi and Reiatsu was reserved for a black box for some reason. Although to be fair, there is still some stuff to enjoy, like the nobody cares about Fullbringers joke, and the part where they said Mama Boomstick was dead. What's her name? Ichigo! But anyways, on to the fight, and I think I like it? I mean, the music is way better than I remember. The Kurama artwork and Naruto close-ups look really good, for the most part. The voice acting is top-notch, specifically with Emile Castagnier as Ichigo. The attention to detail of Ichigo's hollow mask having unique audio effects, and some of the pixel art shots are also pretty great. But I do have some other issues with this one, like, okay, I guess I have one more hot take for the night, but I don't like the believe it line. It just feels a bit unnecessary and forced. Naruto's I can see you was genuinely chilling, but then it's followed up with a believe it line, and it kinda takes me out of it. And the fight includes so much of their kits. On the one hand, that's great. Death Battle rarely does this anymore, and it's nice to know that they were able to do it for this episode in spite of the limitations. But on the other hand, it feels like they go through everything too fast to where there's no room to breathe, yet ironically it feels like very little actually happens. That's kinda hard to explain, but here are a couple of examples that could explain it as good as I can. Let's take a look at this part here. The first time Ichigo gets the upper hand, Naruto uses a shadow clone illusion, and then summons a bunch of other shadow clones to dogpile him with a projectile attack. And then we get to another distraction scene where he uses a shadow clone to distract Ichigo, and then he summons a bunch of shadow clones to dogpile him with a projectile attack. Yeah, Naruto's in a more powerful form, using a more powerful Rasengan, but at the same time, it doesn't feel like he's using his transformation to the fullest. Maybe that's my fault because I'm not a Naruto guy or a Bleach guy, but that's just how it comes across to me. Though to his credit, the second time got a smile out to me, with Ichigo's eyes peeking through his hollow mask and his blank reaction. That was a neat little moment. But speaking of the transformations, they're okay, but most of them are either gone about as quickly as they're introduced or don't feel impactful. Even the first one, while Naruto's "I can see you" is godlike, it's kinda hard to actually see the transformation. And when Kurama comes out, he's not on screen for that many frames, yet it's implied he's doing something grand and powerful. I think that the only transformation I like with no caveats is the Mugetsu transformation. The way that the music cuts off as Ichigo says,
"Is that the best you can do?"
and then just blasts out with these gorgeous looking effects, this awesome shot of it, and the way that just one of his attacks is able to completely black out the screen, that was cool. And apparently this was one of the first videos in history to feature Mugetsu in actual combat, which some people do take issue with, so if you really want to, feel free to explain it to me, assuming that you want to be civil. Because the moment you start acting toxic in said comment is the moment that I deny your entire existence. And if you're allergic to bare minimum punctuation, I'm also going to ignore you. There are people who say that it should have cut Naruto in half, as if Ichigo's sword wouldn't have been able to do that on its own, but sure, I'll pretend this logic makes sense. But if there's a specific reason as to why he shouldn't be using it for combat at all, again, feel free to enlighten me. But there are other issues I have with this episode. The animation just feels really fuzzy and bright, and sometimes it's really hard to keep track of what's going on. I don't mind the saturated look by itself, aside from the blinking waterfalls hurting my eyes a little bit. Just a little. This isn't another Cammy versus Sonya or anything like that. But when looking at screenshots, oh my Lanta, these look ugly. Now, to be fair, other episodes use screenshots like this, but they flow with the fight way better than, well, this. It makes the animation look really choppy at points, not helped by the editing being just as choppy. Let's go back to the Getsuga Tensho scene, and take a look at this shot right here. Ichigo is by himself, he just powered up, and he's up against a nearly unlimited amount of clones. What do you picture would happen? This is a rhetorical question, because what actually happens is a weird POV shot of Kurama, I think, or not Kurama, or is this actually Naruto, and is this a shadow clone? What's with this arm thing going on here, and why does it get a POV shot? There really should have been a scene of Ichigo just blitzing through all of these clones, especially since they argue that Ichigo has the better combat speed. But instead we get this weird moment where Ichigo's animation is looping in 4 separate places. Shots like these hurt the Grand Ray Cero Blast so much because it makes the editing feel so unfocused. But despite all of these criticisms, the death is so great, man. Naruto screaming Kurama's name in just nothing but darkness is such a hype moment. And then you have Ichigo losing all of his power and both Naruto and Kurama launch all of their most powerful Yikes! So brutal that it jump scares Chuck Norris and Segata Sanshiro. Like, dude. And then the outro clip foreshadows Naruto versus Luffy in Season 10. And I gotta give a shout out to the conclusion, which alone is longer than other episodes' fights and conclusions combined. Wait, there's a porn parody quote, huh? They covered their transformations, the differences between movement speed and combat speed. They scale Ichigo's transformations and determining which one is the strongest. This is a really solid conclusion. But it's wrong! Your existence is wrong, but that doesn't stop me from wiping you with the gauntlet, now does it? Now that the episode has gotten better opinions from me, remember when I said Android 18 vs. Captain Marvel's original score was given to another episode because I thought it was better than I remembered? Well, that goes to this episode, sitting at a 58 out of 100. Oh. Sorry, Bleach fans. I know you wanted a good episode, but unfortunately, this wasn't it. And I genuinely can't tell which is the hotter take. Me thinking Metal Sonic vs. Zero is worse than Venom vs. Bane, or me giving Naruto vs. Ichigo the equivalent of a 5 out of 10. Either way, there will be salt shed. But don't let this score distract you from the fact that we need more episodes with conclusions like this. Another Batman versus Spider-Man. The Death Battle Discord I'm in must be really happy because they're weirdly obsessed with this matchup for some reason. Apparently, this episode was almost canceled because of how close it was scheduled to Black Panther versus Batman. They changed their minds and decided to go through with releasing it and kept the schedule the same because... That's the end of the sentence in my script, I genuinely don't know. Terry's analysis was mostly boring, though I did like the jokes they made about Terry finding out that Bruce Wayne was Batman the whole time. Boomstick's joke is that he's pretending to be surprised at the reveal, and Wiz's joke is mocking Bruce for some punk teen finding out his secret. I love it when these two get to be in character. I genuinely hope Modern Death Battle continues this trend.
I got the oil, Wiz. Get ready to lunch. Can we still do it, though?
Jump out of a negative 2-story building onto a pile of stuffed animals.
But most of the black boxes here were essentially useless. Aside from one black box that mentions Terry's suit receiving upgrades based on past failures, every black box has information that says nothing. Like one that says the kind of teenager Terry is, as if they didn't just say who he is out loud. And two that mention the exact same time periods that pennies were made and when they were made of bronze. You didn't need these! At least Miguel's analysis was better in terms of pop-ups, actually covering some feats that he can do and covered some story bits that needed a sidebar. Pity it doesn't make it that much more interesting, but they at least tried to sell you on how different the future is in Marvel's take on 2099 if nothing else. And the backup joke was decent, but the light bright bit was unnecessary.
That's right, apart from...
Oh, Martell, just say the line properly!
But for a matchup that features two characters that take place in the future, where they go in depth as to how different the future is, why does it take place in the near exact same area as the original Batman vs. Spider-Man? Oh, hi Goliath. Complete with the same car sprite that Spidey falls onto. There are other moments like Miguel gets hit by the bolas and wastes time to say that he can't move. This punch from Terry looks so weird. Then we get to ground level, Terry gets a few punches on Miguel, and then the fight just ends. How is the viewer supposed to tell that he planted bombs on Miguel? I mean, yeah, we see them on his chest eventually, sure, but that should have been conveyed before Terry was punching him, not the moment before Miguel dies. Another thing that I've noticed about the fight is that Miguel fights a lot like Peter than he does like himself. They do bring up this entire other suit that they never use, and I can actually understand why. They say that they chose not to include the new suits because of time constraints, and given how this episode was almost canceled, fair enough. But they still bring up a bunch of other gadgets and abilities that he has on his own. They still argue that his power set is so much different that scaling him to Peter is just not a viable option. Yet ironically, the fight feels less like Terry versus Miguel and more like Terry versus Peter. The fight's not all bad news though. I do think that the aerial combat is pretty neat. Yeah, it's animated kinda slowly, but these characters aren't exactly known for their blistering speed, so I'm not asking for them to blitz through one another while in the air. I also don't agree with the criticism of Lila doing nothing. I mean, actually, yes, she does nothing, but to be fair, that is a part of their argument. It's actually pretty crucial to the conclusion, believe it or not, with them saying that Terry and even Bruce have multiple options to deal with Lila. Sure, we don't see all of them, but we still see it happening. And although this black box never once elaborates on how good Brainiac's hacking is, they don't elaborate on Lila's either, only saying superb hacking ability in the sidebar. And they never once elaborate beyond that. Heck, all they really say about her is that she can process hundreds of calculations, she was originally built as a home appliance, and her design was based off of someone who was most likely an asexual. I am not lying about that, look it up! So I don't mind Lila doing less compared to Bruce, but other than that, the conclusion is fine, albeit technically wrong by its own logic in a way, because they did forget to cover how powerful the blast of a ballistic missile is. Oops. While I was surprised as to how many points I could defend, it's ultimately for an episode that I don't care too much about. Aside from some minor jank and a couple of poor uses of corner boxes, nothing's really terrible here. 47 out of 100. It's just the most an episode this show can get. Alright, before we finish off this season ranking retrospective, let's talk about the biggest criticism I've seen this episode get recently. The matchup itself isn't finale worthy, and there was a matchup used earlier in the season that was finale worthy, especially with a more in-depth conclusion. And you know what? I agree. Naruto vs. Ichigo, despite my qualms with it, it's definitely more finale-worthy than Sephiroth vs. Vergil. And although the fight could go to a cosmic scale unseen in most other episodes so far, it really doesn't. It mostly just takes place in one area. But does that mean the episode's bad? Well, I was genuinely thinking this, but let's get into this. For Sephiroth's analysis, they covered his story pretty well, actually. I mean, compared to Cloud and Tifa, who pretty much had respect thread and some occasional insults towards Cloud's moodiness, this episode was a lot more engaging than I thought it would be while still being humorous. Wiz makes a reference to Sephiroth's shampoo and conditioner, and I like the joke about Jovnova possibly being able to make a good breakfast. And it's sad that One-Winged Angel doesn't get to play, but they still include a snippet of it, so that gets my approval. And I think his end clip is great.
Why does he sound so bored?
This one line from George Newbern's Sephiroth is a better delivery than Chad's entire voice acting career. Don't at me. And also cry about it.
Vergil's analysis had some repeats from Dante's analysis, but that's not a bad thing. The first track they used for his analysis is a little weird and out of place, but anyways, that's all my complaints with this analysis, so let's get into the good stuff. Unlike most other analyses this season, they sound like they're actually having fun talking about Vergil, gushing over how cool he is, saying that he's a fan of Street Fighter, and speaking on his feats as if they're exciting. Like when they spend a lot of time talking about this feat. They bring up the size of the monster Vergil punches into the air, discuss how Devil May Cry uses cinematic timing, use the raindrop feat as a means of demonstrating what cinematic timing looks like in action, and then give a calc for this feat, and then they give it an output equivalent to 0.17 tons of TNT, which is wall level. This is the greatest moment in Death Battle. On to the fight, and this was where my concerns started showing up. Vergil's got a wide-looking model and an ass fatter than Tracer's,
but still not as fat as mine.
Though, to be fair, it does get better when he goes into Devil Trigger. Though, honestly, Vergil's voice in general is pretty generic. It sounds more like a typical cool dude voice rather than a voice that Vergil would sound like, but I still like the voice overall. He does get some great lines and deliveries. And while he doesn't sound like Vergil, he at least acts like Vergil. And that's good enough for me. And I actually really like the environment. It's simple, but it gives the fight a distinctly dark mood to it. And then they start fighting one another, and Torian posted a tweet about this episode, saying how he used to struggle so hard with sword combat, and he tried especially hard to perfect it here, lest we forget Sephiroth's sword being twice the height of Mario. But this sword combat is so clean, and I think Vergil's Iaijutsu helped Torian work around this anyway, but hey, they look so fluid and natural, even against Sephiroth not using them. And then Beowulf gets to come out and throw hands with Sephiroth's sword, coupled with a vicious roar from his dive kick. And then the scene where Sephiroth's clothes... Wait, no, I'm actually keeping that. The scene with Sephiroth's clothing is mostly amazing, but the scene where he slashes through one of them is poorly handled with how he randomly decides to phase through one of the clone's attacks and then knock it away the next second. But it gets saved by the spiral swords fighting off the clones and getting rid of them through his sheer speed alone. Yes! Oh, and then we get to the supernova scene where he just summons it outright. And the breakdown in the music is almost perfectly timed with it. One-Winged Devil is so good, you guys! Man, Season 4 actually has some really nice tracks, not gonna lie, Brandon, and not gonna lie, Therewolf. And then it ends with Vergil using Yamato to slice his way out of the dimension, with it overtaxing his healing, which they pointed out was a weakness in his rundown, and Sephiroth takes advantage of it, using the Advent Children meme and slicing him in two. What a death! What an ending! If only the conclusion didn't completely shit the bed for no reason. The research is just bad. Supernova working like a summon is just wrong, even if they tried to back it up, so fair enough to that. But 3.5 billion newtons of force being the strength of 30 Hiroshima bombs? I'm pretty sure that one Hiroshima bomb would do a lot more than destroy one metal door. Yeah, this does go into the whole death battle using the wrong research, as they don't talk about any of Vergil's better strength feats. Hell, they don't even give him Dante scaling, which I think they should have at least talked about. But you know what? I am so happy that this episode still holds up. In spite of Vergil becoming Dr. Livesey a few times, it's one of the best finales in death battle history. 80 out of 100, Sephiroth gang. A solid finish to an admittedly underwhelming season. Even if it ended on a high note, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, and this time I have the sugar, so the joke does work here. I consider Season 4 to be the worst season of Death Battle. I know that other people tend to say that Seasons 1 and 3 are worse, but I can't bring myself to agree with that. For Season 1, it's still a charming nostalgia trip that I enjoy looking back on in spite of how dated it is and sometimes offensive it can be. For For Season 3, while its lows are technically lower than any of Season 4's low points, mostly, it was a way more exciting season list. It featured 3 of my most wanted matchups, and sure, 2 of them actively disappointed me, even if I now know the reasons why they ended up the way they did, but the other one is currently sitting in my top 15 favorite episodes of the show, and may or may not stay there throughout the end of the series, who knows? Plus it had Dante vs. Bayonetta, which is currently in my top 3 favorite episodes, Hulk vs. Doomsday, which lots of people love the episode to death, and I can see why, as well as other sleeper hits like Joker vs. Sweet Tooth, Ken vs. Terry, and Zoro vs. Erza. But with Season 4, well, let's just say that there's a good reason why this is the first season to not feature a fully scripted rundown. Hell, I low-key would have liked to have seen BlazBlue Hate Piece 2, the No One Knows Inning, because at least it would have had something fun to talk about, even if it would mostly just be me screaming. But looking back on the show up to this point, Season 1 was Baby's first steps, Season 2 was Baby's first passion project, Season 3 was Baby's first professional career, and Season 4 honestly feels like Baby's first filler season. And when looking at how I've ranked the series so far, only about 5 episodes from this season are above decent. Yes, Season 4 has a higher percentile of above decent episodes than Season 1, but when we are including episodes that are below decent, Season 1 has 40%, Season 2 has 37.5%, Season 3 has 50%, and Season 4 has 56%. That's a bit more than even Season 3. Though to be fair, Season 4 does have 2 decent episodes, which Season 3 does not. But while I still enjoy Natsu vs. Ace, Thor vs. Wonder Woman, and to an extent Naruto vs. Ichigo, they've definitely fallen off for me. It just doesn't really add that much to the show, and that's why I consider it to be the weakest season. Boring matchup list, mediocre episode output, little to talk about compared to other seasons, and low energy throughout the whole thing. I did enjoy more of the banter than I thought I would, but listen to Boomstick's voice from each season.
This guy can have a freaking bomb blow up in his face and still walk away.
And he even seems to be able to teleport short distances. What the did he just turn into a bird? Part minigun, part rocket launcher. This beauty unleashes a glorious river of death in whatever direction she's facing. It's a buzzsaw made of pure energy. Why don't more Dragon Ball characters use that thing?
Yes, I know I'm absolutely cherry-picking examples, but this is the best way I can demonstrate how I felt about listening to these otherwise mundane analyses. But with all of that said, I was still happy to revisit this season, because episodes like Megazord vs. Voltron, Shredder vs. Silver Samurai, Balrog vs. TJ, and Sephiroth vs. Vergil are all just as good as I wanted them to be. And even Smokey vs. McGruff was better on a rewatch. Much like coming across the worst episode of the show means that it's impossible for an episode to feel insulting, coming across the worst season means that it can only go up from here. And I am happy to say that every season from here on out is not only great at minimum, but is better than every season we've covered so far. Even Season 7. Although we have a long way to go before we reach that point, but we can get there faster if you subscribe!